This video we want to talk about subtracting two functions to obtain a new function. If you've watched the videos on adding two functions, then this is going to be a very similar process. So we have two functions f and g. Suppose I wanted to compute f minus g of -1. Well, very naturally, if we want to compute a function that is the difference of two functions, we are just going to evaluate the first function at -1 and subtract the second function evaluated at -1. F of -1, we put -1 in for x, we get the square root of 4, which is 2. Put -1 in for g, and we get 1, so 2 minus 1, f minus g of -1 should be equal to 1 here. Let's go ahead and compute the general formula for f minus g. Okay. And again, to compute this, we're just going to take the formula for f and subtract the formula for g. So this is the square root of 3 minus x, and we are going to subtract x plus 2. When you are subtracting a function and you make this substitution, it's important to use parentheses because you're going to want to distribute this negative sign correctly over all the terms that show up inside the parentheses. Now at this point we would combine like terms. None of these terms are like, but we will distribute the negative sign to get the square root of 3 minus x minus 2. And again, notice if we plug in a -1 into this formula, we are going to get the square root of 4, which is 2, minus a -1, which is really adding 1, so we get 3 minus 2, which will be 1. So we're going to get the same result as just plugging, or as just taking f of -1 and subtracting g of -1. Now the last thing we want to consider is the domain of this new function. Looking at this expression here, f of x minus g of x, as long as we get a real number out of f and a real number out of g, we're going to be subtracting real numbers, and so we're going to get a real number. So the domain of f minus g is just going to be all the x's that are in the domain of f and g, right? It's the intersection of the domains of f and g, just like it was for the addition of two functions. So to find the domain, I want to first consider the domain of f. F involves a square root, so we need to make sure the expression underneath is non-negative. I'll just add the x over, and as long as x is no greater than 3, then this expression underneath will be non-negative, and so we'll be able to take the square root to get a real number. So on the number line, I'm going to put a dot on 3 and shade in all the x values less than 3. The domain of g is a polynomial, so its domain is all real numbers. So the domain of f minus g is going to be, again, the intersection of these two sets. In other words, the x's that are common to both of these graphs, well, the x's in common are going to be 3, and all the x values less than 3. In interval notation, -∞ to 3 with a bracket using the bracket because 3 is included in the domain.